Remember when MG's first convertible sports car came out? I don't, because I'm like 30, but I remember when its most recent one came out. This is it. It's got a weird name, it's a little bit expensive for an MG, and it's very hard not to draw attention to yourself when you're getting out of it at the shops. But should you buy one? I've been driving around in the MG Cyberster for the last couple of days to answer exactly that question. The Cyberster finds itself here as the only EV convertible sports car on offer, which means it's kind of hard to compare its $115,000 before on-roads price tag to any direct rivals. For example, the Kia EV6 GT and the Hyundai Ioniq 5N are the wrong shape, and the Porsche Cayman has the wrong running gear. Plus, anything else with doors like this costs a lot more money. So, what does $115,000 of MG get you? Well, for a start, it only comes here in one variant, and the only cost options are the colours. Aside from the electric doors, there's the electric folding roof, triple screen cockpit with another centre panel, an 8-speaker Bose sound system, heated electric seats and steering wheel, and ambient lighting. The exterior lights are all automatic intelligent LEDs, and you can open the doors with the key fob. It is, however, missing a couple of things. No phone charger might be down to space, but no wireless phone mirroring is a bit annoying, and the manual steering wheel adjustment feels a little cheap in a 6-figure EV. MG reckons the Cyberster borrows some proportions from its classic sports cars like the MGA and MGB, including things like the long bonnet and rearward cabin. But in terms of those two things, I think the long bonnet might have it. The cabin doesn't sit as far back as it used to on some of those cars, and things like the aerodynamic curves and lines on this car wouldn't have been as important back then either. Don't get me wrong, that's not to say that I don't like the look of this thing. I think it has some pretty angles and cool design elements, but overall I don't think it looks exactly like it came out of the middle of last century. This is the standard colour, it's the only one that doesn't cost anything, and it's called English White, although it's a little bit more of an off-white or a beige or a bone or a cream. But being one of the 3 lighter colours, including grey and silver, it does also mean you get the option of a red roof. Overall, I reckon the Cyberster has a pretty sleek, clean look, but down the back of the car there is one element that I think probably is a little bit odd compared to the rest of it, and that is the taillights that kind of span the top back of the car and then come down into these side parts that are apparently inspired by the Union Jack. I think they're kind of interesting, but they're probably one of the elements on this car I would put closer to the tacky column than anything else. The sleek and clean design that most of the outside has is sort of in contrast with the interior, where it's quite busy. And while 3 screens for the dash sounds a little bit daunting at first, it's probably not that much different to most of those huge long screens that a lot of new cars are getting now anyway. The difference being that, unlike those screens, here you've got one 10.25-inch driver display in the middle and then 2 7-inch touchscreens flanking it on either side. There's also another 7-inch touchscreen down here in the center console, which controls some of the car's functions and the air conditioning. And although it seems quite daunting having all of these screens around you, it turns out once you have enough screen surface, that there's already kind of everything is visible, so you don't need to go through submenus too much. Basically, it's a little bit much, but you'll probably get used to it faster than you think. The other thing is that despite MG's software seeming to be a lot better, it doesn't lag, everything seems to work as it should, some of the placements of the screens are a little bit annoying. For example, when I put my hands on the steering wheel, most of the screens at the side of the driver display are being blocked. You kind of have to move your head to the side to actually see what you're doing with them. The screen to the right, which is furthest away from the center console, is where the reversing camera comes up by default, which is a little bit annoying because it's not where your eyes naturally go to, where the mirror is here. Like I mentioned before, there's no wireless phone charging and no wireless phone mirroring, which is a little bit annoying, and even though that might come down to the hardware space, there's also no obvious place to put your phone. The central storage bin here is big enough, and it's also where the USB-A and C ports are, but it's sort of a little bit of an annoying thing to have to put your phone in there if you've got anything else in there as well. The cup holders can be popped in and out so that they can keep a flat surface in the center console, but aside from that, there's not heaps of places to put stuff. Aside from, just behind me here, there is a pretty narrow section of storage space with some netting that you could put small bags behind the seats. One thing I was a little bit surprised by is the 249-litre boot behind me is probably a little bit more usable than you might think. It's not super deep, but it does go far enough back that you could probably fit some fairly long items in there. The downside though is because this car is a little bit short on space, there's no spare space saver tyre, it's just a can of goop in the back, which isn't really good enough when it comes to Australia. Okay, here's where the Cyberster gets impressive. Its dual motor setup combines a 150 kilowatt front motor and a 250 kilowatt rear motor for a total of 375 kilowatts. Peak torque is a hefty 725 newton meters. All that is enough to get you and 2 tons of MG from 0 to 100 in 3.2 seconds. Sure, it tops out at 208 k's an hour, but the rush of hitting highway speeds is already enough to put your license at risk. There's good news and bad news about the Cyberster from behind the wheel. The good news is that this car is pretty easy to drive incredibly fast. But the bad news is there are just a few things about the driving experience that might make it kind of a little bit annoying day to day, depending on what your situation is and what your preferences are. For me, the first thing I noticed was that the seating position felt a little bit high, even though the seat was already at its lowest level. And I'm 5'11", but if you're much taller than me, the suspension in this car might have your head bumping the roofliner a little bit. It could be a symptom of trying to keep 1,985 kilos of MG tied down to the road, but the suspension in this car doesn't quite feel as sturdy as it should, and especially when you're at high speeds on the wrong surface, you can end up with this kind of undulating, wafting feeling that means that you kind of end up bobbing up and down quite a lot. But the suspension doesn't seem to let big individual bumps crash into the cabin or unsettle the car too much, so it's not all bad. There's also good and bad news when it comes to the steering and the braking. The first of those is that the steering seems to be pretty accurate, even though it doesn't have that much feeling about it. It's a little bit numb with its feedback. Like the steering, the brakes are also pretty good. They actually do the job pretty well. There's some big Brembos up front, but it just comes down to the feeling as well. If you really put your foot down when you need to stop, if you're moving quite quickly, the car will do it. But if you're coming up to a light at 60 k's an hour and you're trying to just put a regular amount of pressure on the brakes, you might find yourself needing to put a little bit more foot down. But stopping's one thing and going is another, and this car is really very good at that. It's brutally fast, but there are also 3 main drive modes that are actually pretty well calibrated. Comfort keeps things pretty calm and cruisy. Sport is probably as much as you'd ever need for the road, and Super Sport has definitely got the potential to draw the attention of the authorities. There's also pretty good adjustability when it comes to things like the regenerative braking, and you can individually adjust the steering wheel feel, even though the difference between light and heavy is just a bit of weighting and doesn't really make it feel any more connected to the wheels in front of you. While there's some impressive engineering when it comes to things like the motors and even the brakes to some extent, the suspension and some of the way that the chassis works just feels like it's not quite tied down enough, and even a couple of times a fairly big bump did unsettle the car to the point where I didn't quite trust it cornering at particularly high speeds. When it comes to noise, there isn't much because it's an electric car, but MG has a sort of synthetic sound that gets pumped into the cabin through the speakers that kind of makes it sound like there's a little bit more intensity going on. The NVH is pretty good for a car with a soft top roof. There's some wind noise, of course, but if you've bought a convertible and you're going to complain about wind noise, that's on you. Road noise isn't too bad unless the surface is particularly heinous, but aside from a rattle on the passenger seat until I kind of moved it away from the surface behind the seats, everything in here feels pretty good. There's not really any obvious rattles or anything like that. So as far as a car to drive around day to day goes, it kind of seems okay in terms of having to live with sort of, the elements of driving a convertible. Overall, it's pretty impressive, some of the stuff this car can do. It's just a shame that it's not more playful. The MG Cyberster has a 77 kilowatt hour battery and a claimed efficiency of 19.1 kilowatt hours per 100 Ks. While that means its claimed driving range of 443 kilometers relies on a bit of energy being recuperated from braking, something you don't really get on the highway, it actually works well in the car's favor during dynamic driving. After 264 Ks of driving on a test loop that included some urban but mostly highway and rural driving, the Cyberster's trip computer displayed 19.4 kilowatt hours per 100 Ks average consumption. The battery sat at 27% with 108 Ks left as estimated driving range. While its total 443 Ks of range seems a little bit optimistic for a car that's likely to be driven relatively quickly most of the time, the efficiency of the Cyberster held up better than you might expect. The Cyberster hasn't yet been tested by ANCAP, but as a sports car, it's far from guaranteed a 5-star rating. The good news though is that it rides on the same platform as the MG4, which has 5 stars. It's got frontal and side airbags, plus all the usual new car tech like adaptive cruise, lane keep assist, blind spot warnings, collision warnings and avoidance, and speed limit warnings. The Cyberster's active safety is actually mercifully restrained, giving a couple of relatively quiet dings when exceeding the speed limit before you turn it off, letting you do the steering even when lane keep is on, and in my case only giving me a driver attention alert when I yawned at a red light. MG's got a 10-year, 250,000 kilometer warranty that's pretty impressive by industry standards, and the warranty also covers its EVs. It's important to note that the convertible roof is one of few items, including 12-volt batteries and light bulbs, that MG covers for less than 10 years. In the case of the roof, it's only 5. It's worth closely reading the fine print before you crack into buying a car regardless. There are also 10 capped price services which occur every 12 months or 25,000 Ks, ranging from $246 to $785. The average price per service is $503.40. MG also offers free roadside assist for the period of the warranty. Cyberster is definitely an impressive thing in a lot of ways, but there's just a few things that kind of let it down. When it comes to its price, it sort of depends on what you're looking for, because if you want a nice comfy EV, you can get one of those for a lot less. But if you do want something that's this fast, then it starts to look like kind of decent value. When it comes down to it, the Cyberster's a pretty impressive look at the sort of things MG could do when it comes to engineering. And it's a pretty good attempt at a sports car. It's just a shame that this first go is a little bit rough around the edges.